Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 70, with, of course, our usual guest host, Tom Libby.
Hey everyone.
Yeah.
I'm doing fantastic.
Tom's doing fantastic. It feels like it's been a while since we talked to Tom, but we just talked to him. We just talked to him last month. So as we go into the month of August, we are going to begin going down a particular road here. We've already started exploring some of this in our shorts episodes, talking about geography and place, and talking about the impacts of geography and place on the psychology of not only writers, but also in the psychology of leaders. And we're going to start this wandering meditation in the well, where I'm at anyway, the triple digit degree heat of the summer. We're going to start this in a little bit more of a northeasterly place, a little bit northeasterly location, and a little bit of a colder environment. And the author that we are going to bring to you today is delivering a meditation on madness, nervousness, melancholy, and the transcendent power of place. And it's a story that we probably should have covered in October, but what the hell, we're going to do it in August because that's how I roll. The Fall of the House of Usher by that great creepy writer, Edgar Allan Poe. From The Fall of the House of Usher. By the way, I'm reading from the Project Gutenberg version of this. Your mileage will vary. By Edgar Allan Poe. And I quote, "During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day on the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half pleasurable, because poetic, sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveller upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it, I paused to think? What was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the house of Usher? It was a mystery all insoluble, nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced to fall back upon this unsatisfactory conclusion that, while beyond doubt there are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us, still the analysis of this power lies among considerations beyond our depth. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify or perhaps to annihilate its capacity for sorrowful impression. And, acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder, even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge and the ghastly tree stems and the vacant, eye-like windows." Edgar Allan Poe. When I say that name, it conjures up several things in your head. Not only the writer, but it also conjures up the character that the writer has become over the course of time. As a matter of fact, we talked a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe's, or we referenced Edgar Allan Poe's great poem, The Raven, when we were talking about Albert Camus and The Myth of Sisyphus with Claire Chandler. Go listen to that episode. I believe that's episode number 66. But when you think about Poe, you think about, like I said, the character, and you also think about the writer, and you sort of merge those two things together. He's that weird person in American literature, and it could only have come out of American literature, where the writer began to transcend even his own work, even while becoming part of his own work in subsequent years. Partially, this is because of the terms of his life. So he was a writer, a poet, an editor, and a literary critic who was best known for his poetry and his short stories, particularly tales of mystery and, of course, the macabre. And I'm thinking of this in terms, I don't know why, but as I talk about Edgar Allan Poe and I talk about his literary life, I'm seeing a combination in my head of the Tiny Toons animated series version of Edgar Allan Poe, where they did the Raven on that cartoon, combined with Vincent Price's voice. And if you don't know who Vincent Price was, go look it up on YouTube. Born in 1819 and dying under unusual circumstances in 1849, Poe was a writer shaped by existential distress and trauma. Rarely placed alongside the fellow romantic New England writers of his time, including Emerson, Hawthorne, and Melville, who we'll also be covering on the podcast. We're going to read Moby Dick coming up here in a couple weeks. Poe stands in a league all his own, where he's become both a myth and, like I said, as a character as well in the American literary history. He was a writer of strict conventions and convictions. He infamously reviewed Hawthorne's books, Twice Told Tales and Moses from an Old Man's, and with an assessment partly informed by his contempt for allegory and moral tales and his chronic accusations of plagiarism, he admitted in this critical review, and I quote, "The style of Mr. Hawthorne is purity itself. His tone is singularly effective, wild, plaintive, thoughtful, and in full accordance with his themes. We look upon him as one of the few men of indisputable genius to whom our country has as yet given birth." Close quote. By the way, that was about the last nice thing he said about Hawthorne. Poe was known to have his literary fights, and he engaged in battles in the pen with poets such as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and most notoriously, he got into it with Ralph Waldo Emerson. Kind of like the celebrity death match between Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg that's coming up here fairly soon in our history. Good fight and good night. All right, on that. So we're going to talk about Poe. We're going to talk about place. We're going to talk about geography. We're going to talk about, maybe we'll even talk about literary fights. Who would win in a fight? Poe versus Emerson. Who do you take on that one? With, of course, our usual raconteur, our usual man about town, the indispensable, indisputable, because who else would dispute him, Tom Libby. So, Tom, talk a little bit about the reputation, because you live in the Northeast. I kind of picked these guys, and I started with Poe because you live in the Northeast. We'll leave it at an undisclosed location, but you live in the Northeast in an undisclosed location, kind of close to where Poe might have potentially wandered around, and so you're knee deep in this, right? A little bit. So talk a little bit about the writing and the reputation of Edgar Allan Poe. What you know about him from high school, maybe, or maybe you know nothing. I don't know, but let's sort of break apart this a little bit of this for our listeners here.
So, I mean, first things first, right? I do know a little bit about Poe, whatever. I mean, and then think of other authors from the time. Again, we have Walden Pond right here, right? Like right down the
Thoreau,
street.
yeah.
Thoreau, right? Frost. There's like a whole museum dedicated to Frost right down the street as well. But I feel like it's one of these weird things. Like, I think and this is going to sound very morbid, and I don't mean it this way, but I think he did himself a service
by dying early,
stopping when he did, right? Because think about this: if he had continued on, his credibility probably would have continued to go downward spiral, not up, because he's attacking these authors and writers that have been, I mean, super glorified, right? Like, some of these writers are, from a historical perspective, like the tops of the tops of the best of the best of whatever, right? Like, we reference them all the time. So if he was continuously just crapping on them all the time, eventually people would have stopped listening to him, right? Number
Well,
one.
and he wasn't well respected in his time anyway. Like he wasn't like his literary criticism, and then he had to wait a while to get published. And then the biggest thing that he got published, that he got recognition for in his time, wasn't any of his short stories. It was The Raven.
The Raven, right. Yeah. But again, to your point, it's like he was like that. I don't even know how to explain it, but he was like that kid that he just did enough of this jabbing, and then when he stopped jabbing, everyone was like, "Oh wait, where'd that noise go? We should probably go look what was that noise about?" And then they listen to it and they go, "Oh, maybe he did know a little bit of something what he was talking about." Like, and then it was like almost like a backward thing, right? I get the same. Let me just give you the modern day version of this, right? Which what could have been. I feel like the same thing could have potentially happened to Stephen King if he had stopped writing like right after like Pet Sematary, right? Like he did Christine and The Shining and Carrie, and then the Pet Sematary. If he just stopped right there, we would have been like, oh, where'd that go? Like, who's that? And then we would have started lifting him on some sort of pedestal, like, because we don't really talk about Stephen King. We all like his writing, we all read it. We don't really talk. When is he ever involved in conversation outside of like real literary people, like people who really like literature, right? But I don't talk about Stephen King on a day-to-day basis ever. But Edgar Allan Poe pops up every once in a while. Like he still pops up. I just feel like Stephen King could have been that guy of this generation if something happened to him.
So Stephen King, and I follow, as you probably would guess, I follow literary Twitter.
I would imagine.
Which is oof, it's comes with its own problems, but it comes with its own challenges, I should say. And Stephen King is huge on Twitter. He's huge, as you would expect. Now, there's three phases. It's interesting you brought up Stephen King because I would not have made that intuitive leap. So that's good way to bring that to me because I would not have made that intuitive leap. You had early Stephen King, which was Cujo, which was his first book. All the way through, I would say, the cocaine-fueled, and he's even admitted cocaine-fueled Tommyknockers, which if you ever read that book, you have to be high out your mind to write that book. Yeah. Oh my God. Like glowing aliens. It's a whole thing. And if
it's insane.
If you've never read Tommyknockers, go read it. My God.
I think this is what the Northeast winter does to people. Think about it. Poe, King, like they're all from here.
This is what I want to talk about. This is the power of place. And then you have like mid-career Stephen King, who goes from, I would say, Tommyknockers, and I can't remember what came after Tommyknockers, like different seasons. He starts writing like the Richard Bachman tales and things like that. Stand By Me was probably the most infamous kind of short story that got turned into a film, right? Out of that group. But he goes from there to, I would say, mid-career Stephen King is right where he got hit where he had the car accident in Bangor, where he got hit by the side of the road, right? And at that time, he was working on Gunslinger, which is my personal favorite series of his. I love The Gunslinger. It's an amazing series. You should go read it, except kind of at the end where it kind of falls apart. But anyway, he gets hit in the middle of writing that, and then like that's where you have like mid-career Stephen King and now we're into late career Stephen King. And late career Stephen King, and I'm going to publicly admit this, I have not read a whole lot of late career Stephen King. I look at his books and I go, and I kind of walk away. And it's terrible because there was a time, and this is also for Poe, where King hit me at a particular visceral level from about the age of maybe like, I'd say maybe 10 or 11, all the way up to probably about 17 or 18.
Yeah.
And then after that, I was done. And Poe's the same way where, don't get me wrong, like I've read Cask of Amontillado, and I've read oh gosh, there was another the Gold Bug story where he explored cryptography, read that. Now Fall of House of Usher, read that now a couple times now. But like you get to a certain point with Poe where you're like, I could probably just leave this.
Yeah.
Place. Okay. So let's get this out early because we are going to talk about this a little bit again, but I want to sort of explore it early and then get back to it, the melancholy of place. So, fall of the House of Usher, which, by the way, is going to be turned into a Netflix series. You might want to pay attention to that, folks.
I can't wait.
It's going to be amazing. Starts from the unnamed narrator getting a letter from his friend, right? And he has to go visit him. For those of us who are living in other places geographically that's not the Northeast, is it really that creepy? Like, really? Is it really, like, past, like, September?
I mean, if I'm being 100% honest, because I'm born and raised in the Northeast, lived here pretty much my whole life, right? But I've visited everywhere else. Like, I've been around the country all the way. The only state, U.S. state I've never been to is Hawaii, right?
Okay.
I've been to pretty much every other state, including Alaska. So I've literally been around the country, and throughout the Caribbean, certain parts of Central and South America. I've been all over the place. And I got to be honest with you, yeah. The only place I can think of, honest to God, the only place I can think of that is even on the same level, it might be a little bit less, but not tremendously less, but it's like that New Orleans, like Southern plantation kind of environment where you get like a decrepit building and like that one building is super creepy and it's probably like the creepy part of town or whatever. In New England, you get like that all over the place. Like you got to remember, we have homes that were built here in the 16 and 1700s still up. And if you don't take care of them, when I tell you they look creepy, man, I'm telling you, it's stuff horror movies are made out of. It really is. Like we just recently went to see Haunted Mansion, right? And whatever, if you like Disney or not, it doesn't really matter. But I know you've seen at least the preview of the house that's in the movie.
Oh yeah.
I looked at that and I was like, what's so scary about that? I can fix that up.
Like, that's a fixer-upper. Where's Chip and Joanna Gaines when you need them?
That's like a New England fixer-upper. No big deal.
It's a no demo reno in the Northeast.
Now, I will say, though, the same house that looks super creepy in October, November is like beautiful in June and July. Like it's literally the same house, but the time of year matters. Like it really does. The time of year matters around here. And again, once you hit late December, January, and early February, everything's snow covered. Who cares? Like nothing looks creepy when it's snow covered. It just looks freaking cold. It looks like day after tomorrow stuff. Like but like. Way
to put it in the climate change reference. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Anyway, like. I thought I'd throw it in there. Anyway, but you know what I'm saying, right? Like everything, it's either super cold and it's like it's cold can also be creepy, but it isn't necessarily creepy because cold also can come across as crisp and clean, right? So you get this like you sometimes like in New England when you get that first snow cover and it's like 18 degrees outside and you step outside and the air just seems more clean than normal, right? Because the snow just pulled all the pollutants out of the air. And you walk out there and it looks almost pristine, like this snow-covered landscape, and it's beautiful. In the fall, you don't get that.
So is this a function? And I'll ask you this. This is sort of touching on a little bit of, and we have on previous podcast episodes touched on this. Your Native American heritage, right? Your Native American background. So is this part of? Like, I wonder how the Native Americans dealt with it when they were there. Like, back in like the 15th century, before like all these like rando, let me be blunt, all these rando Puritans started showing up and like putting up buildings and houses and all that nonsense. Yeah. Like, how are you dealing with, did they have super creepy tents? No.
Because think of this, right? Think of this. And up here in the Northeast, we had either wigwams, wickiups. Those are the dwelling types, right? And even like the long houses of the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee people. When that framework was done, you just collapsed it back down into the earth, and it was biodegradable, 100% biodegradable. You didn't get the creepiness that you get with some of these, cement and stone buildings, and like you got these, the creeping vines up.
Oh yeah.
Like when Mother Earth decides to take over a building that won't fall because it's not biodegradable, it looks creepy as opposed to oh, mother, I said, oh, you're done with that wood? We'll just put that back into the yard. So yeah. But I will say though, still, like, I think that's kind of where my interpretation of, let me half a step back.
Mm-hmm.
I think my native side, like the deep roots to the native community I have here, I think that's why I view the winter the way I do, right? Because the winter is, to me, it's purifying, it's clean, it's beautiful, like it's really nice. And by the way, when native people were required to hunt in the winter, it was also slightly easier to track animals. They left trails in the snow. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that the moose went that way or the deer went this way, like, you know. So, but not that it made it easier. It didn't make it easier to hunt and actually kill them. I'm just saying, like, you could track them better, like, you know.
Oh yeah.
So,
yeah. You that elk or whatever the hell you're tracking, that shows up really well against the white snow. Like it really does. Yeah. Right? Okay, so the other follow-up question to this is, so you've got, and we'll kind of explore a little bit of this, but when we get to this, the next part coming up here, but Poe was a master of understanding psychology before Freud, like the psychology of the creepy, which I think is what, well, his lifetime, the events of his lifetime and the writing of his lifetime occurred during the beginning and the middle of what we call in the United States, at a religious level, the Second Great Awakening, right? So there was a lot of very powerful preachers working their way through the Northeast, talking about, you know, the Holy Spirit and transcendence and all that kind of stuff. By the way, a lot of the modern churches that we have today came out of the Second Great Awakening, and the modern religious denominations like Baptists,
Mormon,
Presbyterians, Episcopalians, right? All of them came out of that, and we're going to get into that, a little bit of that coming up here. But Poe was around for the beginning parts of all of that, right? He's also considered to be a romantic writer who sort of previewed the worst excesses of the Second Great Awakening, and some of the worst excesses of the Second Great Awakening were in seances and trying to summon people back from the dead and get them to talk to you. And Poe sort of anticipated some of this. Interestingly enough, so did Nathaniel Hawthorne. A lot of what's in the Scarlet Letter, which we're going to cover in our next couple episodes coming up on the podcast this month. Hawthorne struggled massively with the nature of his Puritan ancestors and like how judgmental and persecutorial he perceived them to be. And then he like went full bore into nihilism, which is a whole other kind of thing that you get into with Hawthorne. We'll cover that. Again, we'll cover that on a later podcast. But you got to have all those people dynamics happening at the same time that you are building between 1819 and 1849 Boston out, which is, I mean, the Founding Fathers didn't consider, Boston was never a city that was under consideration to be the capital of the United States. It was never under consideration. Unlike Philadelphia. Philadelphia was under consideration. New York was under consideration, you know. But Boston never. And I've always wondered why. You know, and I wonder if it's because of that puritanical religious streak that sort of, that honestly still exists in Boston, but it's so muted that if you could walk through Boston, and I've visited Boston several times, and I've always said the interesting thing about the biggest problem with Boston is it's full of Irish people. That's the biggest problem. And all my listeners from Boston can now come for me. It's fine. All you boys from Southie, yeah, you all come for me. It's fine. It's fine. Whatever. I got something for you. I'm not afraid of any of you. Any of you schmucks from Lowell? Anybody want to handle me? What? Anybody? Anyhow. But Boston is its own thing. Like, even as a sports town, like, my God, if you didn't have the Patriots for the last, 20 years, it'd be the worst sports town ever. Oh, what? What? Am I wrong? Am I wrong in my analysis?
I don't know about war.
There's something in that. There's something in the place
Yeah, I don't
all of this like self-misery.
But in the last 20 years, all three of the other major sports have at least won championships in the last 20 years. All three.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm not saying they win it. And to your point, I mean, the Patriots have won six Super Bowls. They've been to 10, right? So it's like, they're always in it. So if you even take that out of the equation, the Celtics have won in the last 20 years. They're in it just about every year. Now, I had no delusional thought into thinking they were going to win the championship this year. Some of my colleagues did. Some of my Bostonians or whatever did, and I was like, they're not going to win. Anyway, I was actually surprised they made it through the first round, but whatever. The Bruins, the same thing. The Bruins, the same thing. They're always in the conversation, but they have won a championship in the last 20 years. Actually, two, if I'm correct, if I remember correctly. They've won two, and they're always in the conversation, but I knew they weren't going to win this year either. I just knew it.
But that sense right there, like, I know we're in the conversation, but we're not going to win. Like, that chip on your shoulder stuff, that comes from somewhere.
No, but I'm not expecting to win. If you talk to 25 other people from Boston, they're like, yeah, we're going to win it this year. Yeah, we got it. We got this. And I'm like, and I'm the one sitting there going, we got what? They're going to be decent. They're going to be good. They're going to be in the conversation, but they're not going to win. Like, who do you think we are? Like, we're not New York. Like,
well, and that's fundamentally the thing that you get the sense of on the East Coast, that there's three cities on the East Coast that are constantly, it's like three little kids in a room.
Yes, it's like the three. It's like I know where you're going with this.
You know where I'm going with this, right?
Yeah,
you got Philly, you got New York, and you got Boston. Those are your three cities,
right?
And that's it. And New York City, like, Boston would love to get New York City's attention. It's like the ugly second kid that would love to get
it's like the big brother, right? Like, New York's like the big brother that middle child is always like trying to get, like, look what we can do, but you're not paying attention. And Philadelphia is like the youngest one of them, going, F you to all of you, and I'm going to do whatever I want because I'm a punk and I'm a this and I'm a that. Hey, Philly fans, listen. I love the Eagles, just to let you know. They're one of my favorite teams. Even though I live in New England, I love the Philadelphia Eagles. So I'm just letting that out there right now. It's one of my favorites. And listen, if the NFC is, I'm rooting for Philly or San Francisco, my two NFC teams. I love both of those two teams. Well, anyway, my point is, like, but Philadelphia, you think Boston's, those people are nuts, man. The police department had to grease the lamp pole so people didn't climb up and do stuff to them. Like, you don't have to do that in Boston. Like, anyway, but you're right. There are basically there are three towns that really make the sports community the sports community. Now, don't get me wrong. There are other towns that want to be there. They like, they'll put their hand up every once in a while, but they're like that cousin that, like Baltimore, like they're like that. We got a football team. We've won a championship before. Yeah, no one listens.
No one cares. Nobody cares. Well, and then you've got Toronto, which is your weird Canadian cousin.
Toronto,
and why do you always show up? Who is that?
Yeah, exactly. Those are out of town. Those are we still have family in other countries.
Well,
anyway. Back to Poe. We can talk about this all day long. But anyway,
welcome back from Sports Talk on the.
I think you're heading down a question here as to why was Boston never considered part in the conversation of, like,
of national capitals.
Honestly, I think part of it was just location. If you think about where Philadelphia is and where eventually Washington D.C. ended up, it's more middle ground. Like, it's more middle toward the middle of the country, even though it's on the coast, but it's like middle. So I think Boston was never in. By the way, think about the time frame, the time of this, right? In the 1800s, when, like, you'd have literal icebergs in the harbors. Like, you don't want your delegates from other countries coming into Boston in January. Like, that would just been, that's terrible. That's why none of these world summits are not held in Oslo in January. Like, if you're going to Oslo for a summit, it's in August. Like, there's a reason for this, right? So anyway, I think part of it was
Klaus Schwab doesn't want to rent an icebreaker
exactly
to, like, get through Boston Harbor.
And I think New York was at least in the conversation because it was just south enough that it doesn't quite get that bad. New York's cold in the winter, don't get me wrong.
Oh yeah.
But it's always like when we're having a nor'easter, which is one of the worst storms we can have up here, and we're getting dumped with 3 feet of snow. New York is like 3 feet. We got 3 inches. You guys have good luck with that. Like, whatever. Like they'll get snow, they'll get cold, but it doesn't quite get as bad as Boston. I think that's more of the reason. Somebody might have brought up Boston one time, and they would have been like, "Yeah, shut that down real quick," because we're not having like the King of France and the King of Spain coming over to Boston in December. It's not happening. Like I think it was more of a logistical thing.
And then the delegate from Massachusetts went off and decided he was going to split Spain off and just have them go be their own thing. Okay, exactly. That was his revenge. All right. I think we've covered a lot of things here. I think we've gone around the horn. I think we've covered a lot.
I'm sorry. What story were we reading again?
Yeah. Back to the book. back to the story. Back to the fall of the House of Usher. This is what we were reading.
That's what it was.
Yeah, that's what it was. No, you're not listening to Sports Talk. You have not stumbled into the wrong podcast. We just went down a road there, as we often do sometimes here.
Absolutely.
Just to explore some things. All right. Back to the Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. So we're going to pick up with this idea of place. And I quote, although as boys, and it's the narrator talking about himself and Roderick Usher, the second character here. Although as boys we had been even intimate associates, yet I really knew little of my friend. His reserve had been always excessive and habitual. I was aware, however, that his very ancient family had been noted, time out of mind, for a peculiar sensibility of temperament, displaying itself through long ages in many works of exalted art, and manifested of late in repeated deeds of munificent yet unobtrusive charity, as well as in a passionate devotion to the intricacies, perhaps even more than to the orthodox and easily recognizable beauties of musical science. I had learned, too, the very remarkable fact that the stem of the Usher race, all-time honored as it was, had put forth at no period any enduring branch. In other words, that the entire family lay in the direct line of descent, and had always, with very trifling and very temporary variation, so lain. It was this deficiency I considered while running over in thought the perfect keeping of the character of the premises with the accredited character of the people, and while speculating upon the possible influence which the one, in the long lapse of centuries, might have exercised upon the other. It was this deficiency, perhaps of collateral issue, and the consequent undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony with the name, which had, at length, so identified the two as to merge the original title of the estate in the quaint and equivocal appellation of the House of Usher, an appellation which seemed to include, in the minds of the peasantry who used it, both the family and the family mansion. As we were just talking about, this is part of the melancholy of place, right? Or subtitled, never go visit your sick friend who you haven't seen in many years. You don't know what you're going to be running into. Geography, like we were just talking about and just kind of breaking down in place, where you happen to be on the map, carries as much meaning in your life as other elements do. And I want to talk about this, yes, in the context of the Northeast, which we've kind of broken down, but then also, because I'm as well-traveled as Tom is, in the context of the rest of the United States. Like I too have visited almost every single state in the Union. I've been to Mexico. Haven't been fortunate enough to go to Central America. Oh, yes, I have. I've been to Central America and the Caribbean. I have not been to Alaska, but I have been to Hawaii most recently this year. So we're kind of flip-flopping on that. But but geography and place mean things to people. Geography shapes people. But we don't, in our very modern, very sophisticated world, we don't really pay too much attention to this. And I think that's one of the knock-on effects of globalization. And if people do think about it, it's sort of in a transient, flittering sort of thinking that doesn't really land on the whole of the problem or the whole of the nut to crack. Where you are on the map matters for who you are, as well as for what you like. And it matters for what you write, if you're a writer. So you have a country, and this is the big thing to consider here, and for my international listeners as well, you may want to think about this. the United States of America spans a third of the continent. Okay, I believe it's the second largest continental landmass on Earth after Asia. Okay, we're a third of that landmass. And so the United States, of course, is going to produce writers as varied as Edgar Allan Poe, all the way to Charles Portis. And we just sort of take that as being, well, we take that for granted here in this country. We just do. And yet, think about it with other countries. Indian writers, you can definitely identify as being from India. Russian writers, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Chekhov, like those are the big three, right? And then you come to the 20th century and you've got Solzhenitsyn and then that's, well, I mean, I'm not going to say that that's about it, but you've got Solzhenitsyn, right, in the 20th century. And maybe there are more excellent Russian writers that I'm unaware of, but they would be clearly distinctively Russian. Swedish writers, like the guy who wrote, or the person who wrote The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo series, they are distinctly Swedish. Or Amitav Ghosh, right? The Indian writer who wrote a series of books that has been compared to the Moby Dick of books from India, right? He's a distinctly Indian writer. Or other international writers that we've covered on this podcast from places as varied as Nigeria and Brazil, Japan, and, of course, Germany. But those writers coming from those places have distinctive voices. But America, the United States of America specifically, my God, we're all over the map. Literally all over the map. So, Tom, we've got a country that's got Cormac McCarthy, that could hold Cormac McCarthy, who just recently passed away, who can write about being in New Mexico and being in the high desert, but who can also hold the creepiness of Poe, right? Or the judgmentalism of Nathaniel Hawthorne, all in the same, like, bucket, right? For leaders, this is a real challenge, right? And leaders don't really think too much about it. But talk about the power of place. And again, this is something I think maybe you resonate with from your background and your experience you resonate with. But talk about the power of place and geography and how that all has come together for the United States.
Well, and also like how it changes you and your interaction with those other places, right? So it's not just about you and your place, it's about you and your place interacting with them and their places, right? So, and what I mean by that is, it's brought up to me often that I, like, literally born and raised here in Boston, but people have a hard time hearing the accent that they're thinking should be coming out of my mouth. But that's very purposeful, right? Because the very first, so for those of you who don't know me, I also spent a lot of time in sales and marketing. So, but my very first sales job was fine. It was a local job, so I was only talking to local people, and I can say "can" whatever, whatever. But I was like, the very first role that I took, where I interacted with multiple people throughout the country and multiple layers of people throughout the country, it hit me. Like, it hit me really hard. Where so I was a major account rep. I had very big companies as my clientele, and they were scattered throughout the United States. And I was talking to somebody from like Irvine, California, or another person the very next day was from like Florida, whatever, right? So, but this woman I got on the call with, and she's like, "Oh, how's everything doing up there in the Northeast or whatever?" And I was like, how could you? It was literally the first time I had ever heard somebody single me out because listening to the sound of my voice, right? So I was like, and again, I was a kid. So again, in fairness to me, I was a kid. I was like 25. I didn't know diddly squat from anything. And I was like, oh, how did you know that? She's like, oh, I can hear it in your accent. I'm like, I don't have an accent. You have an accent. Like, I can hear your accent a mile away. Some Southern, accent or whatever. And she's like, oh, sweetie, we all have accents depending on where we're from. And I went, oh. And it made me think, right? Like, it really made me think. And I went, first of all, let's get this Boston accent right out my mouth right now. I want to hear somebody be able to tell where I'm from just because of the word, a single word that comes out of my mouth. They go, oh, I can tell. So, but I will tell you, as much as I've tried to work it out, it still pops up every once in a while. Either if I get super excited or super mad, or if any emotion goes to an extreme, happy, sad, mad, glad, doesn't matter. any emotion goes to the extreme, my control of the English language goes right out the window, and the Boston accent just comes flying out. So, so I just wanted the listeners to understand where I'm coming from when I.
This is where you get Matt Damon in Good Will Hunting. This is where in the bar when he's like, go get in your car.
Yeah. What, you want to hear me talk about my car and Harvard yet? You know, like. I never realized how odd it sounded until she said that to me, and then I was like, oh damn, I'm never letting that happen ever again, right? Like, so I started making a very conscious effort to enunciate, pronunciate, all that stuff, like better. Now, that being said, I didn't want a Southern accent where they're over accentuating certain vowels and letters either, and then I'm told the Midwest has no accent, so I was like, well, I don't want that. I want somebody to know I'm a person, like that I come from somewhere in the United States. But anyway, but to your point, so back to the question at hand. I just wanted to lay some foundation for why people. That being said, I do think, especially in business, right? So if you're talking about business leaders, I think it's super important, even with the globalization of things, even with the commodity of communication that we have right now, right? So I, as a consultant, can do business with anybody in the world real time, right? Like, it doesn't even matter. Like, I have clients right now around the globe. I have clients in India. I have clients here in the U.S., Southie, as a matter of fact. Anyway, I have just thought I'd bring that up for you.
That's fine. I'm okay. That's fine.
They're not going to care. Anyway,
they're not going to find me.
Yeah, that's true. But with the globalization of communication, I think it makes it really interesting. Now, again, that being said, I think it's interesting that my attitude, my thought process, the way that I approach problem solving changes depending on who I'm talking to from around the country. Like, okay. So people down south, like, again, when I'm talking down south, my brother moved from here in Massachusetts. My brother moved down to North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And after being there for about 15 years, I mean, to me, he's North Carolinian. I'm sorry. He's a hurricane now. I don't care. He's not from Massachusetts anymore. And because his whole mentality of how to deal with things changed, right? They have a little bit more relaxed attitude. They have a little bit more relaxed way of approaching things. They have a little bit more relaxed. So when I deal with a customer that's down in that area of the country, I can't come at them with the Northeast mentality of bull in a China. That we just are. The Northeast is very, very fast, very highly motivated, very challenged. Like we just think, and it's not just Boston, by the way. It is that like I tell people all the time, if you take the Northeast from Philadelphia north, we're basically the same people. I'm sorry, I hate to tell you that, New York, but you're the same as us. We're the same as you. So is Philadelphia. We're all the same people. But if you go after Philadelphia and down toward that southern part of the country, mm-hmm. minus Florida, and I'll explain in a minute. If you minus Florida from that, if you talk about the Southeast, you talk about like south of Pennsylvania to Florida line, to the Georgia-Florida line. Mm-hmm. Florida is its own little entity because Florida has its influx from a lot of different places. There's a tremendous amount of Northeasterners that retire to Florida. So
right.
Again, so Florida's a little different. Florida's got like a weird mix mentality, but again, so Northeast, Southeast. But if the Northeast is dealing with the Southeast, and again, the perspective of are you the customer or the client matters, because if the customer's in the Northeast, then I need to make sure that I mold my viewpoints to try to match their viewpoints or vantage points. I shouldn't say viewpoints, their vantage points, so I can at least see and understand where they're coming from, right? So I can't come, for example, I have a gentleman down in the north in the Southeast right now that I'm dealing with. I can't just hit him between the eyes with something that I feel like that I can do with somebody here from the Northeast, right? I'm going to sell you this phone. I'm like, listen, dumbass, this phone is what you're asking for. I'm going to sell you the phone. Give me the $1,000, take the phone, you're done. Like you gave me all the parameters. This phone fits, you're selling it. The guy from North Carolina says the same thing. And they're like, so here's the phone. Why don't you take it? Why don't you take it out of my hands? You hold it. You hold it for a minute, and you tell me how that feels. Does it feel good? all right, we're ready to do business now, right? Like, and I'm not making fun of them. I'm not. That's
No.
not my intent. My intent is just that they view the vantage point of business is a little different. Now, again, same thing. You could say the same thing going across the entire country, right? Where you grow up and how you do business as a young entrepreneur matters. Like where you go to school matters. Again, we have people. My daughter's first roommate come from L.A. Her first winter in Boston, I thought the poor girl was going to have a heart attack. He was like, "What is going on right now?" Like,
There's stuff coming from the sky, and I don't know what it is.
Yeah. She's like, "What?" I didn't realize the thermostats went down below zero. Like that's actually an honest to God statement, by the way. She thought that the thermostat went to zero and stopped. Like nothing went colder than zero. And I was like, "What, are you kidding me?" It's like the wind chill out there is -22. The thermostat has to tell you that. So anyway, but again, back to the point at hand, right? So I think that it is important. I think it's important not only to understand where you are and where you're from and how business happens where you're from, but I think it's also important to understand if you're going to go outside of that comfort zone and you're going to sell from the Northeast to any other part of the country, it's up to you. It's your responsibility to know and understand how business is done in the rest of you cannot force them to fit if they're the customer, you can't force them to fit into your box. You have to make sure you fit into their box. And that the sale goes a lot faster. The interaction goes a lot better if you are the seller and you understand the buyer, better. Now, again, the other way around, if somebody from outside of the Northeast tries to call me and sell me something and they do what I just did with the cell phone, I'm hanging up on them. I'm hanging up on them. I don't need to hold the phone. Tell me what it does. Tell it how it works. If it works, if it does what it does, I'll do it. I'll buy it. And then let me buy it and go away.
So it's interesting that you're bringing this up because I just had not a revelation. Here's how I'll frame this. Somebody gave me feedback about doing business so I'm in Texas, right? Different than Tom. And I came out of the Northeast and came to Texas. In the great American move around, known as COVID. So I was part of the great American move around, right? And so I came here 3 years ago, and I am in a spot in the core training and development business right now where weirdly I'm back in startup mode because of having to move my business out of the Northeast, the business structure, and move the structure into Texas and do all those kinds of transitions. And Tom is exactly correct. The way business happens in Texas is radically different than the way business happens in the Northeast. And it's the thing that struck me was that I was actually told this by a real estate agent when I was shopping for a house here. And one of the things he said was, and he was exactly correct. He's like, you in the Northeast, you do the business first and then you have the relationship. Us here, we need to have the relationship first before we do the business. And at the time I was like, oh, that's a good piece of feedback. I'll keep it. And I put it in the back of my head. But it took like 3 years. It's like yeast working its way through the dough. It took 3 years for the yeast to work its way through the dough. And I had a revelation, probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So this is interesting that Tom is bringing this up because I had the exact same revelation. Now the emotional impact of that statement has now hit me, where it's not necessarily about the relationship. It's the way in which trust is established is different in different regions here.
Yes.
So you talk about the Southeast. Texas, for all of you who are listening, Texas is so big, it's the size of Germany, that it can actually be divided up into 4 different regions. And the region that I live in is closer in posture to the Northeast, but it's still Texas. So you still have guys walking around in cowboy hats and cowboy boots and jeans in like 110 degree heat, unironically, and they're doing just fine. With no irony at all whatsoever. This is how they dressed this morning when they got up to go to work. Like they just do. And so the piece of feedback that I got from that person, that real estate agent, now clicks together in my head with something that I heard from, and Tom will like this, from the great sales coach and leadership development and motivational speaker guy, or not guy, but professional, who died probably about 10 years ago now, 12 years ago now, Zig Ziglar. I was a huge Zig Ziglar guy, huge, loved Zig Ziglar. And he was telling a story because he was from Yazoo City, Mississippi, which Mississippi is fundamentally different even than Texas, my God. You know, he wasn't from Yazoo City, but he was born there, and he went to Arkansas and spent a lot of time his sales career back in the 1950s and 60s when you had to drive around to talk to people, like, and knock on doors and go do demonstrations in people's homes and things like that, selling what was it, cast iron cookware door to door. Like, and Tom's a salesperson, so he'll appreciate the difficulty of exactly how hard that was.
No, thank you.
But, like, what are you going to do? Back in the day, what are you going to do? There was no internet, like, no phone books. Like, what are you going to do? You got to get out there and go see the people.
No e-commerce platform? What?
I got to go to people's house. This is insane.
Can't just go to Amazon?
Anyway, so Zig told a story about his wife, and this is how this relates, about his wife and how she supported him during the time that he was launching basically Zig Ziglar Industries and turning himself into a speaking and motivational person. And he said, you know, during the 5 years that I was doing this, all I was in was deals. No money exchanged hands for 5 years. And at the time when I first heard this, I was a young person, relatively young, younger than I am now, driving around upstate New York trying to make deals happen, right? And I heard this and I couldn't comprehend, because I was in the Northeast. I was in upstate New York. I couldn't comprehend how you could just have deals for 5 years and not have any money exchange hands, because I was in deals for 4 months or 9 months or 6 months or 8 months, and then money would exchange hands and it would be fine. Like, how do you hold on for 5 years? But when I moved my business here to Texas, then all those 3 data points started to click together in my head, and they started to layer together. And it's true. In North Central Texas, the relationship has to come before the business. And no one's really too concerned. I won't say no one's really too concerned. How you eat for 5 years is your business. You didn't get the sale today? Sucks to be you. Good luck. You need to have my trust before I'll give you money. Yeah. In the Northeast, they don't care. I won't say don't care, but in the Northeast, the business, and this is to Tom's point, the business brings the trust. And the relationship can come later if it's going to come at all. But here where I live now, and this is again something that I had to get my emotions around, because it is an emotional state you got to get around too in sales. The relationship has to happen to build the trust before the business can come. And it's a major adjustment. It's taken me like 3 years to kind of really turn that boat in my head. And it does shift, by the way, to Tom's point again, how I deal with people from other parts of the country. So if I'm dealing with people from the Northeast, I can literally go right to, like, I'm having a sales meeting this week with someone from the Northeast. I can literally go to, well, I won't say like Goodfellas, I'm not going to say F you, pay me, but like, pay me. Like, I can literally say that. But I would never say that to a client in Texas. The door closes.
Well, and by the way, it's not that, so I not to contradict what you're saying, but there's a little bit of like, I think it's just there's a sped up process, right? So
right,
like, so here in the Northeast, like I'm not going to just hand somebody money for a phone. Like I used the phone as an example earlier. Yeah. I'm not just going to hand somebody money and take their word for it that the phone's going to work. There are certain things that we do, and again, like, so to your point, building a relationship with somebody first and like really getting and understanding them and trusting them and all that stuff, and it's wonderful and it's great. In the Northeast, we're like, no, show me there's a guarantee, a warranty, I can return it. If it doesn't do what you're saying it's going to do, I'm giving it right back to you. Like, and I want that in writing. I don't need to trust you. I just need to trust that legal document is going to give me permission to go take my money back, right? Like, right. But the trust out, I mean, the relationship after the fact is when it does what you say it's going to do, when it does work the way you promise it's going to work, now they'll buy anything from you. Like that, right. It's like, it like opens floodgates where you guys do that in reverse, right? So correct. Again, there has to be trust involved, but we get our trust in the Northeast from fact, figure, legal, right? Fact, figure, legal. It's like, if you can prove it, you can show it, we can do, all right, I'll buy it. I don't care. Because quite honestly, the other philosophy that we have up here is, I don't need to like you to do business with you. If you solve my problem, I will give you money to solve this problem, even if I don't ever have to talk to you ever again. I don't care. I don't need to like you. Now, if I happen to like you after the fact, all the better, which is where the relationship after comes from, right? Like, if you do what you say you're going to do and it works and everything's great and I like you, we don't have to like you. We don't have to like you to solve a problem.
Well, and in major cities in, I would argue, Texas and in the West.
Yes.
In major cities, it works kind of like that.
Similar, yeah.
Absolutely. But I live adjacent to Dallas-Fort Worth and doing business in a town that's adjacent to Dallas-Fort Worth, where it is a touch more rural. Like, I'm not going to give you money. I don't. And by the way, this is why I like Westerners too. I like people from the West too, a little bit more than people from the Northeast, because people from the Northeast will sometimes snow you with the smile and be like, oh, I like, eh. And the upper Midwest, oh my God, they'll do the same thing. I lived in Minnesota for 10 years. Oh my God, they'll do the same thing. But here, they'll tell you straight up, I don't like you. Go away.
But
I like that. I like the directness.
Yeah, I'd be like, all right. Now at least I know where I stand.
Right. Now, thank you, sir. I will get right in my truck and drive away. You have a good day. And after that, they're basically done, you know? And by the way, they won't give you a bad review. They're not going to go do some passive-aggressive stuff on, like, Yelp. Like, they're not going to do any of that nonsense. They're going to tell you, I don't like you. I don't like the way you showed up. I don't like the way you presented yourself. I had a person tell me, you're a little bit of a fast talker. I don't like that. And I was like, this is just a speech. Okay, you know what? You have a good day. No, you have a good day. I'm having a good day. I'm leaving. I'm out. So, you know, you kind of have those conversations from a sales perspective. But this also applies to how you lead leaders or how you lead followers, right? How you lead groups. Because if you're leading a group of people who are maybe from, it's easy to pick on Texas. Let's not pick on Texas. Let's say rural Montana, right? You're going to have to understand the geography of rural Montana and how that has led to, particularly in a country like the United States, how that geography has led to not arrogance and not hubris, but it's more like a sense of self-reliance. Because who's going to, I try to explain this to folks in the Northeast, the reason, and this is parallel to a lot of things with, like you see in gun culture in the Western United States, who's going to show up to save you?
Yeah.
Like the cops aren't 4 minutes away. The cops are 28 minutes away.
I mean, let's face it though, you're in downtown, I mean, if you're in New York City, the cops aren't 4 minutes away.
Well, yeah, the cops aren't showing up anyway. Right. That's another thing for another day. But we're being broad.
No, but I know what you mean.
You know what I mean? Right. Yeah. And so that gets to a sense of self-reliance. Well, how are you going to lead a bunch of self-reliant people from Montana? You're going to have to make appeals to that in some kind of meaningful way.
Well, it kind of goes back to something like, I've made this comment on your podcast now probably at least 2 times, probably maybe 3, and this might be the 3rd or 4th. But again, if you're leading people from different parts of the country, so I'm here from the Northeast. If somebody picked me up and said, Tom, we love how we're going to hire you. We want you to come lead our sales team in Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, pick a state, doesn't matter. And if I have the mentality of, well, I'm the boss, I'm the leader, I'm in charge, I'm going down there and I'm going to tell them to do this and that. You're going to fail. You're going to fail. So I've said this a couple times on your podcast, whereas don't just do something, stand there, which is the complete opposite we're taught when we're kids, right? We're always taught, don't just stand there, do something. Like, oh, people are freaking out. Don't just stand there, do something. Well, I was always taught the opposite effect, which is don't just do something, stand there. Meaning, don't just go in there and start making policy changes and changing processes and all that stuff without knowing and understanding the dynamics, the landscape, the whatever. That's not to say that you can't, but it's weird. This is going to sound really funny because I literally just had this conversation with a client at noon. I got off the call with them at about 1 o'clock today. And because she said, I was on a call with a salesperson. This is a sales engineer. So they have sales engineers and BDR type people, whatever. And so they called me because they wanted my advice. The BDR was just talking to talk, and they wouldn't let the customer finish their sentences. They wouldn't let, like, how do I deal with that? And I go, well, first things first, don't just go at them with it. Don't just go in there and be like, listen, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. If you just beat them up, you could potentially lose that person as an employee. And before you do that, ask yourself, do I want to lose that person? Do I care if I lose that person? If you don't care, then go ahead and hit them with a ton of bricks. Like, go ahead and hit them with everything. If you do care, if you don't want to lose this person, if this is the first time that you've had this experience with them, you have to stop and step back for a second. Maybe ask them a few questions. They might know something that you didn't. For example, they're a BDR. They've been on the calls with this particular customer 2 or 3 times before they bring a sales engineer into the call. So for all you know, that's normal interaction with them. So why are you going to ridicule a salesperson for doing what is normal for their relationship with that client, with that customer? I said, so don't just react. Listen, ask some questions, understand, make sure you understand the dynamics of what's going on before you just go in there and check. So I would say the same thing to leaders going into different areas of the country. Like, don't just go in there like a bull in a china shop. Don't just go in there. And being from the Northeast, believe me, it takes some reserve. Like, it takes some talent for you to not do that. Because I walk in there and I'm like, no, I see 100 things I want to say because these people suck, whatever. But I can't, right? Like, I go in there, I stop, take a second, understand the dynamics, understand the landscape. Make sure I understand who they're selling to, because who they're selling to may make a difference in the way I react to process changes or process improvement or whatever, right? So again, it's the landscape matters. It matters. It matters geographically. It matters hierarchically. Like, depending on where in the hierarchy that you're selling to. I mean, you could be selling to direct managers, could be selling to the mid-range, mid-level, C-level, C-suite, whatever. Like, all that matters. Like, you need to really know and understand before you do.
Yep, absolutely. Well, back to The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. We're gonna kind of switch gears a little bit here. We're gonna talk about depression with a New England touch, which you have to when you're talking about Edgar Allan Poe. Upon my entrance, Usher, this is him now walking in and first meeting Roderick. This is where we're at in the story. Upon my entrance, Usher rose from a sofa which he had been lying at full length and greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it, I at first thought, of an overdone cordiality. Speaking of going directly to the thing, overdone cordiality, of the constrained effort of the ennui man of the world. A glance, however, at his countenance convinced me of his perfect sincerity. We sat down, and for some moments while he spoke not, I gazed upon him with a feeling half of pity, half of awe. Surely a man never before so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the man before me with the companion of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at all times remarkable. A cadaverousness of complexion, that's a word, an eye large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of a surpassingly beautiful curve, a nose of a delicate Hebrew model, but with a breadth of nostril unusual in similar formations. By the way, pause. That's Poe's gentle way of telling the paying attention reader, or the attentive reader of the 19th century, that Roderick Usher is Jewish. Just want to point that out. Going back, a finely molded chin, speaking in its want of prominence, of a want of moral energy, hair of a more than web-like softness and tenuity. These features, with an inordinate expansion above the regions of the temple, made up altogether a countenance not easily to be forgotten. And now, in the mere exaggeration of the prevailing character of these features and of the expression they were wont to convey, lay so much of the change that I doubted to whom I spoke. The now ghastly pallor of the skin, and the now miraculous luster of the eye, above all things, startled and even awed me. The silken hair, too, had been suffered to grow all unheeded, and as, in its wild gossamer texture, it floated rather than fell about the face, I could not, even with an effort, connect its arabesque expression with any idea of simple humanity. In the manner of my friend, I was at once struck with an incoherence and inconsistency, and I soon found this to arise from a series of feeble and futile struggles to overcome a habitual trepidancy and excessive nervous agitation. By the way, pausing, what that means is the guy was suffering from anxiety. Go back to that. For something of this nature, I had indeed been prepared no less by his letter than by reminiscence of a certain boyish trait, and by conclusions deduced from his peculiar physical conformation and temperament. His action was alternately vivacious and sullen. His voice varied rapidly from a tremulous indecision, when the animal spirits seemed utterly in abeyance, to that species of energetic concision, that abrupt, weighty, unhurried, and hollow-sounding enunciation, that leaden, self-balanced, and perfectly modulated guttural utterance, which may be observed in the lost drunkard or in the irreclaimable eater of opium during the periods of his most intense excitement. Let's have a chat about opium. So, Poe there is describing Roderick Usher, right? And he's describing, and by the way, a lot of the sentences in Fall of the House of Usher, and Tom can attest to this as he did his homework before this podcast and read the story. A lot of the lines in there are complicated, multi-layer sentences, right? With a lot of semicolons, a lot of M dashes being used to separate ideas. Radically different than the ways in which we consume written material, or even the ways in which we speak now, right? It's almost written in a Shakespearean fashion, or, if you will, a poetic fashion, which is why, again, Poe got fame for The Raven and sort of laggard in fame for his prose. I think he was probably a much better poet than a prose writer. But he was also a romanticist, and this goes along with conceptions of the Second Great Awakening, and the ideas that came out of the Second Great Awakening religiously that led, of course, to the creation of the Baptists and the Episcopalians and the Pentecostals and other folks in the 19th century. But the subplot underneath there, right, was a plot of, or the sub-idea underneath the Second Great Awakening was this idea of romanticism. By the way, this was even a thing in Europe at the time, right? So the Romantics were folks who believed in the ability of feeling and emotion to overcome rationality and logic. And they believed that feeling and emotion were a better, particularly feeling and emotion through art, were a better measure of the impact of a piece of literature, a piece of art, than rationality itself. Romanticism in literature showed up in Poe. Romanticism in the visual art showed up in a guy like Gabriel Rossetti over in Europe. Let's see. Romanticism in music showed up early in a guy like, I would say probably... Well, no, I'll go a little bit later. In German music, in Wagner, actually, that's where Romanticism showed up, was in Wagner and music. So kind of think of that, think of Romanticism in that arc as we talk, as I mentioned these kinds of ideas that I have here. But Romanticism also had a dark side to it, and Poe explored a lot of this. And it was a dark side that was focused around depression, around anxiety, nervous agitation, ennui, which we would just call a depressive state, basically, and existential crises that were kind of welded onto this feeling of romanticism, right? It was this idea that you could romanticize depressive feelings and depressive states, so that they would become part of your character and make you, in essence, interesting. But there was a tool for these depressive states that was used, and David Courtwright, the author of Dark Paradise, A History of Opiate Addiction in America, estimates that the annual total of opium imports for all of the U.S. ports between 1827 and 1842 was over 27,000 pounds a year. That's insane. And Boston merchants, according to Mr. Courtwright in his book, were the dominant American opium traders.
Of course we were.
Boston was ground zero
All
for
right.
untrammeled opium addiction in the 19th century.
Let's just clarify one thing here. At that time, that was really, people thought of it as medicine. Like, I understand it was an addictive thing. I understand it was a property of it, but they were used in hospitals and Boston even to this day.
So before you get all defensive, the Bostonian gets all defensive, let me point out that, yes, you are correct.
I just want to make sure it's different than the opiate imports today. Like,
yeah.
You know, these are legal imports because they thought they were doing the right thing. They were medicine, and again, I'm not defending Boston per se. I'm defending the country as a whole at that point because opium was importing a lot of opium.
The country as a whole was importing opium. Poe lived and came to his maturity in his writing on the edge of the beginning of an untrammeled opium addiction problem that was beginning in the 19th century. And so he got to see ground zero, this sort of develop. Right. And by the way, he had personal experience with this because the typical treatment for maladies such as tuberculosis, depression, anxiety, and by the way, his 13-year-old wife that he married, his 13-year-old cousin that he married, more on that later, but he married his 13-year-old cousin. She eventually died 11 years later of tuberculosis or consumption. And the number one treatment, or not the number one, but one of the main treatments for tuberculosis, if you could not go out west to the Western Territories and dry yourself out, and this is where folks like, what's his name that rode with Wyatt Earp after the Civil War. Anyway, doesn't matter. It'll come to me in a minute. But the gunslinger that rode with Wyatt Earp back in the day, he went west, right? Because the New Mexico territories had opened. But there was no territory at the beginning of the opium addiction or the beginning of the opium importation in the 19th century. So you just died of tuberculosis. Well, there was a ton of pain involved in that. And so, of course, the doctors...
prescribing opium.
Exactly, we're prescribing opium. Now, the other thing is
not hugely. It's not that dramatically different than today.
That's right, exactly.
You have some sort of surgery, and the first thing they give you is some sort of painkiller after the fact, right? They're like, oh, you're going to be in a lot of pain. Take this opioid, and if they're not careful with getting you off of it quickly, that transition from Percocet or Demerol or any of those other can very quickly turn into something that's uncontrollable.
Absolutely. And then you wind up in the bottom of fentanyl.
So you have literally the same problem in 2023 that they had in 1840. It's insane to me. It's insane to me.
This is the point that David Courtwright makes in his book, where I pulled that statistic from, talking about how basically, and you've said this on the podcast before, Tom, how more things change, the more they are the same, right?
Yeah.
It's literally the exact same cycle. The only difference between now and then is the pharmaceutical companies are now, shall we say, or were anyway. Well, and it's been proven in court too, compensating doctors for the pushing of these prescriptions. And the other major difference is when the prescriptions can no longer be had these days, people people can go to fentanyl, which by the way, interestingly enough, most opium came out of China and was imported back into China by the British in order to addict the Chinese. And now the Chinese have turned around and are making fentanyl and exporting it through Mexico into the United States. Just think about that, folks. So, opium addiction and Poe. So he was around all of this, right? And the typical treatment, by the way, for tuberculosis was laudanum. Laudanum was almost, I think, like 80% opium. It was just literally straight opium that you could drink. You could just go get it if you were a person who needed it. Mostly women were addicted to opium, and so that's the other sort of insinuation that he's making about Roderick Usher, is that he is sort of a feminine temperament. This is one of those things where every detail in the story matters. This is one of those stories, like no detail is sort of thrown away or wasted. And so the question becomes, Tom, why do Americans like their addictive substances? Why do we seem to like, if it's not bad food, that we shouldn't be eating from like McDonald's. And no, we shouldn't be eating McDonald's. They're not a sponsor on the show, so I can say McDonald's. Like, we shouldn't be eating McDonald's. Like, fried foods are terrible. Like, everybody knows this. Everybody knows. And yet, you know, from fried foods, which are socially acceptable, by the way, no one's boycotting McDonald's or shutting down McDonald's.
No.
But from fried foods to fentanyl, and that's a gap. Yeah, we really like our addictive substances. And by the way, with social media, we really like our addictive TikToks. We really like our addictive Netflix shows. Why are we so?
Well, first things first. I don't think that's an American thing, right? I think that because my son. For those of you who don't know, my son moved to Spain. Like he lives in Europe right now. And he deals with similar things over in Europe, right? So like I think it's a human thing. I don't know my point. I think it's a human thing, right? Not an American thing. But I think and if you watch the movie The Social Dilemma, I think that does actually explain a little bit of it. I think that movie explains the addiction to social media, but I don't think the rules are different until you get to a physical addiction. Those are a little bit different, obviously. Like when you're talking about, opioids, fentanyl, that's a physical addiction that you need medical help to get rid of those addictions. But habits can come across as addictions. I get into these conversations with my kids a lot. They're like, oh, I'm addicted to this or I'm addicted to that. And I'm like, nope, you have created a habit around that is not an addiction, because if you stop doing it right now, nothing happens to you, right? Addiction is when you have a physical reaction to the stopping of something that you're doing, right? So again, opioids, fentanyl, that's truly an addiction. That's a problem. You go through withdrawal symptoms, you go through real hardship on yourself, on your body, on your psyche. There's hardships involved in that when you try to come off of those substances. So, and I guarantee you, anybody listening to this podcast right now has had some sort of experience with this, whether themselves or a family member, but they have had direct. I don't know a single person. I do not know a single person that has never had experience or been through some sort of addiction problem with a family member or something like that. It's heart-wrenching. It's heart-wrenching when you are not the one that's addicted to these things and you have to watch your family member go through this. It's terrible. But I want to change this conversation a little bit to be more productive about your question, which is like, why do Americans like their addictive? Why do Americans like their habits? I'd like to talk, because I think that's more appropriate, right? Because let's
talk about why we like our habits, right?
I think there's like this. Think about. I mean, this goes back hundreds of years, right? Because everything that we do has to be systematic, right? Like, you want to change a law, you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do this. There's like these systems involved. So in order for you to get this habit, you have to form this habit into a system, because your TV program. I'm going to watch this TV program because I like this TV program. I'm going to watch it. I'm going to watch it every night. Tuesday, 8:00. I'll use myself as an example, because I am a lunatic when it comes to Jeopardy. I love it. I watch Jeopardy every night. I have to. I plan my dinners around it. This is a habit of mine, not an addiction, because if I stop doing it, it's not going to cause me any visceral harm, right? Like, it's not going to cause me any problem. But I love it. I love Jeopardy. I'm going to watch it every time. Now, I justify this by saying I learned something. I learned stuff when I watch Jeopardy. I learn it. I learn stuff. Do I really? I don't know, but I'm just going to go with it, because that's my justification. That's my justification for forming the habit that I've formed, and I don't think anyone's ever going to talk me out of it. Now, when you form habits that are not able to be justified that easily, and you defend them based on emptiness, i.e., I'm going to eat McDonald's because I love McDonald's. McDonald's is awesome. I'm addicted to McDonald's. I love McDonald's. No. You're not addicted to McDonald's. If you stopped eating McDonald's tomorrow, nothing's going to happen to you. And what exact argument are you using for eating McDonald's? Because it's useless, it's pointless, and it's not going to work. You're not going to be able to justify. It's healthy. It's like what justification could you use to?
I really like the yellow and red logo. You can't take that away from me.
Sure I can. What if McDonald's changed their logo tomorrow? McDonald's could change their logo tomorrow. You don't know. It's not the logo you're attached to.
I'm going to go to Long John Silver's.
Exactly, because it's got the yellow. But you see where I'm going with this, right?
Yes, I see where you're going. Yeah.
It's like We form these habits, and then I think the bigger problem is how we've manipulated the idea or concept of habits to addiction. I think because addiction is a real medical problem. It really is. It's a real problem.
Do you think? Do you think that this is
decided,
because? Do you think that this is because do you think we've mapped addiction to habits? Because now this is something that occurred to me. It's now occurred to me a couple times while you've been talking. Do you think that we've done that because, unlike the romantics of a couple of centuries ago, we don't really romanticize habits, and we don't romanticize addiction. Like, we don't think that there's like some higher good that we can get to by doing these things. Now, partially that's because we live in the 21st century, we live in the wake of the death of God. So we've talked about that on the podcast before. You kick out the transcendent, then what do you got, right? You just got your addictions, and you got your habits. That's all you have. But they don't like raise you up to any higher level. And by the way, other people know that. And so they have nowhere to they have no appeal to you at a higher philosophical level. So like, if I come to you and you really like McDonald's, what arguments am I going to make to you to get you to stop eating McDonald's?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the point of it, right?
Yeah.
But if you give somebody an alternative habit that, like, so again, if you said to me, I don't know, Tom, did you know that in order to get all those hamburgers, McDonald's kills little babies in Afghanistan? I don't know, whatever, right? And I went, wait, what? And you go, yeah, Burger King doesn't do that. Burger King, same food, you can eat the same shitty stuff. Burger King donates money to those same children's organizations, and you're like, screw it, I'm eating Burger King now. My habit changed like that, right?
So that's the power of marketing, right?
Right. Yes. But addiction. Tom, you're hooked on cocaine. Take this, Sudafed or whatever, like this pill, because it doesn't work that way. If you're truly addicted to something, you can't get off of it by replacing it with something else.
Okay. So how do we?
A better example of that would probably be heroin and like Suboxone and methadone and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
You're just trading one addiction for the other. Granted, one's probably a little better for your long-term health, but you're still trading one addiction for another.
Sure. And everybody who goes through, or not everybody, but a lot of people who go through AA or go through Narcotics Anonymous or who go through, yeah, exactly. And to your point, I mean, I've had friends who have gone through those processes. I have friends who have, anyway, I've had my own personal history, with that. And even in my own family had history with that. And even me myself, like I flirted with being on the edge of addictive, not only behaviors that could have led to potential addictive problems, but we're on that line of what you're talking about between habit and addiction, where that physical need now kicks in, and now we're into another spot, right? Okay, so and by the way, just for the purposes of our listeners, just so we can be completely transparent here, alcohol has always been, in America, the number one addictive substance. It's always been, hands down, going away. Ever since people I don't think it is anymore. I think today, if you look at the statistics, it might be caffeine. Okay.
But still. Yeah. So, but okay.
Yeah, but alcohol's, I mean, it's the big boy, right?
Yes, for sure.
And, we did prohibition in this
caffeine's
country.
never ruined families, and alcohol has, so we'll just leave it at that.
Right. And we did prohibition in this country in the 1920s. That didn't work. And then we sort of wandered into this area where we kind of talk but don't talk about alcohol. Okay.
Yeah,
fine, cool.
Exactly. No, we romanticize it now. You talking about romanticizing? Think about the marketing commercials and stuff that come out about alcohol. We don't talk about the problem, but we certainly romanticize like the partying, and not even just that, but the affluentness of certain alcohol. Like marketing has ruled the world when it comes to alcohol. Are you kidding me?
That is true. No, I agree with that. No, that's a point we're taking. I'll take that point, for sure. So how do we? if we don't know the difference between our addictions and our habits, and I think your broader point is absolutely true. I think people don't know the difference between their addictions and their habits. I think people merge it all together because they're merging different stuff in the hierarchy in their head,
Yes.
right? They're just
Yes.
collapsing it all together. So when I'll use myself as an example. When I'm laying in bed at night, watching reruns of NYPD Blue on Hulu, which, by the way, yes, ladies and gentlemen, I do sometimes do this.
God, I love that show.
Instead of reading Moby Dick, and my wife comes in and gives me this look like, "What are you doing?" and then like walks out. I have a choice there that I can make. I can either turn off NYPD Blue and go to sleep, or I can watch the rest of the episode and then watch another episode. Or then now I'm into binge watching, or I can turn off NYPD Blue. I can pick up my copy of Moby Dick that I have by the side of my bed, read a couple of pages of Moby Dick, and then I can leave. Or I can go to sleep. Or I can turn off. I can never turn on NYPD Blue in the first place, and I can read Moby Dick, right? And my wife will ask me a different kind of question, which is, "What are you reading there? You reading Moby Dick? Okay." And then she's going to walk out. Okay, those are all of the options that I have for pursuing various habits. Is there an argument to be made that leaders need to pay attention to their habits and the habits of their followers?
Oh, good God, yes. Absolutely. You know what? The one thing that we don't talk about anymore that I think when I first came into the workforce was talked about a lot. It was valuable. And for some reason, we don't talk about it anymore. And a lot of it's remote working and there's a lot of things. But do you remember talking about the conversations at the water cooler, right? And I'm not, you didn't necessarily have to have a water cooler, but I'm just saying leaders could learn a lot by overhearing conversation about from their employees talking to each other about what's going on, their habits, their work. Absolutely. I think we can, not only that, we can learn a lot about our people, knowing what their personal habits are, like watching NYPD versus reading a book versus whatever, because let's talk about this for a half a second. When people ask me, how do I motivate my salespeople better? How do I get my salespeople to do this, do that, more that, whatever? And I go, we have to find out what motivates them. And they go, well, they're salespeople. They're motivated by money. Nobody is motivated by money. Nobody. Zero people are motivated by money. You have to figure out what motivates them to earn their pay. They make money to live. They make money to do the things that they want to do, to spend the time the way that they want to spend it, i.e. reading Moby Dick or watching NYPD Blue or whitewater rafting or whatever the hell it is that they want to go do. They work so that they have enough money to do that. You occasionally will have somebody who has thoughts of grandeur and say, I'm going to be the best salesperson in the world. I'm going to make millions of dollars selling whatever. So my goal is to be the number one salesperson in the world because I know that person makes $10 million a year. That's my barometer. But think about what I just said there. What's really driving that person? Is making $10 million a year driving that person, or being number one in the world driving that person? Because everybody mistakes it for money, right? So to your point about what leaders, I think leaders can learn a tremendous amount about their people by listening to and understanding their habits. And it doesn't even have to be the work habits, but it should be. I'm just saying it doesn't have to be. It could be a lot of things outside of work. But if you really, truly know and understand what motivates people, and some people get motivated by different things at different places and different times, meaning when I'm at work, maybe I just want to be recognized as a good employee. Maybe that motivates me really, really. I will go above and beyond my job every single time somebody says something to me like, man, Tom, that was unbelievable. You're one of the best employees we have. Trigger, habit, I'm going to go do it again. I'm going to go find. Whereas at home, it's different. My motivation at home might be a little different. So learning and understanding all of those dynamics might be a little much, unless you're one of those kinds of employers where you really you think of your employees as family. Great. Then go figure out, go know all their wives' names and husbands' names and kids' names and dogs' names, and what motivates them is go for it. But at the very minimum, the minimum bar to hit should be knowing and understanding what motivates them at work. And if it happens to be their family, then let them know that you care about them, that you care about that family. I know you're here to earn a paycheck to take care of that family. I'm going to help you do that. Here's how I help you be an employee that's never going to be at risk of getting fired. You're always going to have a job here because you're going to do this, this, and this. Motivate them the way that they want to be motivated. Don't motivate them the way you think they want to be motivated. That's not a good leader. That's a dictator. Come on. That's that. You've seen it. You've seen these memes 1,000 times on social media, right? Where the leader's standing in the sled whipping the people. I mean, sorry, the dictate, like the boss, right? Mm-hmm. My way or the highway. It's my company. I own it. I'm going to whip everybody into shape. They're standing on versus a leader that's in front of them pulling the sled with them, right? Like there's a big difference to that. Well, that leader that's in front of them pulling the sled with them is asking them about themselves the whole time. How do I make you better? How do I help you out? How do I help you help me, Mr. Jerry Maguire? Like, how do you...
You don't know what it's like for me being out here for you.
That's 2 movie references in one podcast. I don't know what's going on here.
Oh, we're gonna challenge each other here about movies in a minute. But back to the book, back to Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. We're going to turn a corner here on this one, because I think we probably squeezed about as much out of this as we possibly can. But there's a little more juice left in the bottom of the rind on this one. And by the way, it is a short story, so it's only, when it's printed out, it's only around 7 pages. You can go burn through it really very quickly.
It's a short story that's going to take you 20 minutes to read and us 2 hours to talk about.
That's right. Exactly. That's correct. That's right. This is the little services that we provide here on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. All right. The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. Back to the book, or the short story. All right, around in the corner here. I could not help thinking of the wild ritual of this work and of its probable influence upon the hypochondriac when, one evening, having informed me abruptly that the Lady Madeline was no more — by the way, the Lady Madeline is Roderick Usher's sister — he stated his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight, previously to his final interment, in one of the numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. By the way, pause. Poe really, really liked vaults and tombs and caves and basements. Yep. The power of place.
Well, because in the Northeast, all of those things are creepy.
All of them are creepy. All of them. Back to the book. The worldly reason, however, assigned for this singular proceeding was one which I did not feel at liberty to dispute. The brother had been led to his resolution, so he told me, by consideration of the unusual character of the malady of the deceased, of certain obtrusive and eager inquiries on the part of her medical men, and of the remote and exposed situation of the burial ground of the family. I will not deny that when I called to mind the sinister countenance of the person whom I met upon that staircase on the day of my arrival at the house, I had no desire to oppose what I regarded as, at best, but a harmless and by no means an unnatural precaution. At the request of Usher, I personally aided him in the arrangements of the temporary entombment. The body having been encoffined, we two alone bore it to its rest. The vault in which we placed it — by the way, he also liked vaults — and which had long been so unopened that our torches, half smothered in its oppressive atmosphere, gave us little opportunity for investigation, was small, damp, and entirely without means of admission for light. Lying at great depth immediately beneath that portion of the building in which was my own sleeping apartment. It had been used, apparently, in remote feudal times for the worst purposes of a dungeon keep, and in later days as a place of deposit for powder or some other highly combustible substance, as a portion of its floor, and the whole interior of a long archway through which we reached it were carefully sheathed with copper. The door, of massive iron, had been also similarly protected. Its immense weight caused an unusually sharp grating sound as it moved upon its hinges. Having deposited our mournful burden upon trestles within this region of horror, we partially turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin and looked upon the face of the tenant. A striking similitude between brother and sister now first arrested my attention, and Usher, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured out some few words from which I learned that the deceased and himself had been twins, and that sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Our glances, however, rested not long upon the dead, for we could not regard her unawed. The disease which had thus entombed the lady in the maturity of youth had left, as usual in all maladies of a strict cataleptical character, the mockery of a faint blush upon the bosom and the face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip which is so terrible in death. We replaced and screwed down the lid, and, having secured the door of iron, made our way, with toil, into the scarcely less gloomy apartments of the upper portion of the house. Tombs, vaults, crypts, basements. Something interesting when you move to other parts of the country. So you mentioned Florida. I do know people in Florida, and I've been to Florida a couple times. Florida is an interesting state. It is a conglomeration of about 8 different things altogether, all of which I'm shocked work in one geographic area, and are probably barely held together with spit and tape and superstring. But in Florida, there are no basements. Now, there's a reason for that. The reason is that Florida's a peninsula. You try to dig a basement, you go down 15 feet, you're going to hit the Gulf of Mexico. Okay. Or the Atlantic Ocean, depending upon which side of the peninsula you happen to be on. In Texas, where I live, there are very few people who are any expertise in building houses, in building basements. And it's not because you couldn't build a basement in Texas. You actually can. It's because the dirt that Texas sits on top of is so fine and sifting that concrete and cement actually don't hold up. A friend of mine actually just put in a walkout basement, and he had to pour in, get this, $120,000 of concrete just to do a walkout basement.
Oh my good Lord.
Yeah. Now in the Northeast, you can have a basement from Vermont all the way to Philadelphia because it's all granite.
Well, not only could you, but it's very highly recommended.
It's highly recommended, right? But that's because you're in the northern ranges of the Appalachian Mountains, right? The Alleghenies and all of that. All of y'all geographically are placed up against that rock. And of course, if you go out to Colorado and points further west, which are closer to the Rocky Mountains or the Sierra Nevadas, you will run into basements there. And this is just an example. I'm just bringing this up as an example of something, a function of a house, a function of your home that is fundamental to how people live, but it's driven by geography. It's driven by place. Roderick Usher put his sister in a tomb. And I don't want to ruin the surprise, but
I was going to say something about that too. I was like, oh, you left out the last part of the story.
I did. Let's just say in true Poe fashion, well, what is, how does
all things aren't what they seem.
All things aren't what they seem, no. And the mockery of fate blush upon the bosom and face in the strictly cataleptical character, well, that strictly cataleptical character reveals itself towards the end of the story. We just took a story here that on the surface doesn't really have that much, but allows us to jump off into other things. And this is one of the conceits of this podcast, is that we can actually do this. And in thinking about the end of the story, which we did not get to when we talked about addiction and a bunch of other things, there's a poem in here about dragons, right? And Poe does an interesting layering piece, not in the piece that I was reading, but he does an interesting layering piece after Madeline is entombed, and tells an entire story about dragons and about the lady fair being saved from a dragon. There's a whole poem in there. The lady fair being saved from a dragon, and of course Poe is bringing in elements of this mythical story to indicate that Roderick Usher was trying to position himself, or maybe it was the narrator trying to position himself. I can't really tell, but one of those gentlemen was trying to position himself as sort of a Sir Lancelot type, right? He was going to save Madeline, and then that all sort of inverts on itself when you're running, screaming. The question becomes, if dead things don't stay dead. William Faulkner, infamously back in the day, the great Southern writer from Mississippi, who served in World War I, he said, the past ain't the past. It ain't even done with us yet, basically. Like, it's not done, right? Poe took that, or began really that idea, and then Longfellow, and then folks who came after the Civil War. By the way, point of order: Civil War is when opium addiction really kicked up in the United States, because now you could deliver it in syringe form to Civil War folks, right? And it was the only thing that helped when you were amputating people to stop infection. Which, when I read that, I was like, oh, okay. How do we as leaders, what do we as leaders take from the fall of the House of Usher about geography and place? A lot of this story is driven by hypochondria. So it's driven by the idea that something's happening when our scientific rational materialism in our day tells us nothing's happening there. You're just winding yourself up over nothing. It's hypochondria built up and ramped up to the level of a mental illness. And I think this, by the way, resonates in our time, particularly coming out of COVID. I think this resonates in our time because it's the things that we can't see that get us. And the things that we can't see. And by the way, we struggle with this. This is the other aside thought here. We struggle with this as postmoderns because we think that we've mastered everything that can be seen. But we know, or we have an intuition in our hearts, that there's all this other stuff underneath the water. And at a certain point, Madeline's gonna come up, and she's gonna want to have a conversation with us. So, how do leaders deal with that dynamic on their teams? We'll kind of close out with that question for you, Tom. How do we deal with that dynamic of all the other stuff underneath the surface that could get us, the creepy stuff?
Well, I think part of it, I mean, I don't mean to sound repetitive here, but like, you don't know what you don't know, so don't create something that isn't there. Don't just.
Which is what hypochondria is, by the way.
It really is, yeah. But how do you stop yourself from doing that? It's by asking questions and getting involved with the right people and making sure you're. Listen, I'm not a business coach, but I'm going to tell you right now that the best athletes in the world still have coaches. I don't care if you're a Tom Brady fan or a Michael Jordan fan or LeBron James, Michael Phelps. Pick all the Wayne Gretzky, whatever sport you want. There's always like the greatest of the greats of the greats. Guess what? All of them have in common. They all have a good coach. They all have coaches that were there for them. Even if it's not to perfect them, even if it's for them to bounce ideas off of and say, I think so. Again, I go back to business, right? It's like, so go find a business coach that you can use as a sounding board. Now, by the way, it doesn't have to be a business coach. It could also be if you're a bigger company, use somebody on your C-level team. You're the CEO, president, CEO. Talk to your COO, your chief operator, or your CFO. Make sure that one of those two guys are checking and balancing your brain, making sure that you're not seeing stuff that isn't there, or you're not creating a mountain out of a molehill. Maybe there's something small that you are all of a sudden thinking it's a big deal, or that kind of stuff. But it doesn't have to be an external source. It can be somebody on your team. If you don't have that, go get somebody outside of your team. If your team's too small, or you feel they're too close to the problem, go get somebody who is. I'm sorry, I hate to say this, but pay them. Pay somebody to be your Jiminy Cricket, to be your extra set of eyes or ears.
Fourth movie reference. All right, let me make a fifth movie reference. Office Space. Bill Lumbergh did not know how to deal with Milton with the stapler. Milton was considered a creepy guy. Milton was a character right out of Poe. And if he hadn't been out of Poe, Poe would have written him. Yeah, okay. Lumbergh had no clue how to deal with that guy other than to fire him and put him in, ironically, the basement.
Go figure.
And yet, not to ruin the surprise on Office Space, one of the greatest work movies of our time, bar none.
Totally agree.
Bar none. He burned the entire place down, just like he threatened he would. But no one wanted to deal with Milton. Why? Because Milton was considered to be what by the people in the office? It's a C word and it rhymes with EP.
He was too creepy.
That's right. Nobody wanted to deal with him. Lumbergh. So should Lumbergh have gotten a coach?
Definitely.
Deal with Milton?
Well, no, in that case, I mean, if they're that creepy, come on, dude, just fire the guy. I mean, if you know. I was talking about jumping to conclusions about things that you don't know, right?
By
Like,
the way, that was a game that was created in Office Space by the guy who got his neck broken in the car accident. Jump to conclusions.
right.
Or they would jump on the dots.
Jump on the dots, yeah. But it's serious. In all seriousness, right? Like, there's reasons why the best of the best still have coaches. So even if you feel like you're at the top of your game in your industry, that does not mean that a person with a fresh set of eyes and ears can't give you something that's worth it for you to make. And maybe it's not about making you or your company better. Maybe it's just simply about making your people better, like making you a better leader. Maybe you don't get more profit out of it, but maybe you get easier profit. Maybe it's like something doesn't come naturally to you, so you figure out a way. Again, I think part of it is just like, listen, we all have blind spots. All of us have blind spots in everything that we do. I mean, it's not a matter of being perfect. It's just a matter of getting a little bit better every day, improving every day, right? It's really, that's really what it's all about. And if you can't do that on your own, if you can't do that by reading a book, by reading or watching a motivational speaker, listening to podcasts, whatever, then you should go and find somebody who can help you walk through this. Like, it's not, and again, you don't have to pay them. You know, it could be your wife, your husband. It could even be one of your kids. I found this fascinating. At the time, my now 24-year-old son was about 8 years old, and I was going through this weird phase at work with, like, I felt like I had hit as many home runs as I was going to hit in the job that I was in, and they're like, no matter what I did, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered what I did. I was going to maintain that level of, this is where I'm going to be, like, for money or for whatever. So my son, 8 years old at the time, I was bringing him to baseball practice or something like that. And we were just shooting the breeze. He's like, what's the matter, Dad? I'm like, work's just been tough. Now, it's an 8-year-old kid. And he goes, tell me about it. I'm like, wait, what? So I told him, I was like, you know what, bud? Screw it. I'll tell you. I'm like, whatever. Because I was also at the thought, like, if I say it out loud, if I get it off my chest, maybe it won't bother me. Maybe it won't bother me as much that I'm going to stay stagnant. Like, that whole, like, therapy thing, right? Like, whatever. And I'm not downplaying therapy. I'm just.
You're just putting it. You're just using a term that you're fine.
Right. So I'm talking. I tell my son about this whole thing, and I'm like, listen, I translate it because we're going to baseball practice. I was like, they'll be like, you know how sometimes when you play a game of baseball, you only get up to bat like 4 times. If you hit a home run all 4 of those times, that's it. You're done. Like, that's the game, right? Like, you don't get to hit another time just because you hit a home run.
Right.
I go, that's kind of like the way I'm feeling at work. And he goes, yeah, but you can't start the day like that. And I go, what do you mean? He goes, what if you go to extra innings? And I went, okay, but that doesn't mean anything to me, right? Like, I'm sitting there like, whatever, right? Okay. And he goes, and I go, yeah, but what if you don't? And he goes, yeah, but you don't know that when the day starts. Like, when the game starts, you don't know if there's extra innings. You can hit 2 more home runs if they hit 2 more home runs. If, like, somebody else on the other team hits 2 more. I'm like, okay. So now I'm exploring this with my 8-year-old son. Okay, I'm like, so tell me more. Well, what I got out of that conversation, honestly, had nothing to do with baseball. It had nothing to do with home runs. It had more to do with my own preconceived notion that I don't know what I don't know. I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. I don't know what the next day is going to bring. But I walked into every day thinking I knew. I walked into every day thinking, this is it. This is the end. This is Judgment Day. This is it. Not realizing that, and I'll even tell you what ended up, the end of the story was, I ended up I was at a maxed out client level, right? The way that the job that I had, I could only have so many clients. I was at the maxed out job level, client level, and they were at, like, I maxed out their budgets, man. I'm like, when I figured out a way for them to spend all their money. What happened about, 2 months, 3 months after my son's conversation was, one of my clients split off into another company, and refused to work with any other person than me. So
Okay.
even though as a company policy we had a max at the level of customers that we were supposed to have, I kind of broke that by the customer saying, we're not dealing with your company unless we deal with Tom.
Right.
And so then I looked at my boss and I was like, all right, well, if I have to my first thought was, which client are you taking from me? And he's like, I'm not taking any of them from you. They're all spending all their money. What if I take them from you and we drop our revenue because of it? I'm going to get fired.
Right.
I'm not going to get fired. I'm just going to add him to your account database now. But isn't that against the company rules? He goes, screw it. And I'm like, oh, so in other words, there's no rules. I was like, all right, now that I know that, I'm going to go find more companies to do business with so I can be better at what I do. Like, Anyway, I guess the point I'm making here is you should never be thinking you're alone in any of this. You should never, because you can use your wife, your husband, your kids, your cousin, your friend. Go to the bar and talk to the bartender. Don't give away trade secrets, but you know what I mean. But like, you need a sounding board. You are only one person. You're only one human being. Your conceptual mind can only go so far by itself. Mm-hmm. I don't care if you're Elon Musk or if you're Mark Zuckerberg, as you talked about your celebrity death match earlier. It doesn't. Those guys did not do that by themselves. They just didn't. I'm sorry. Facebook was not designed by Mark Zuckerberg all by himself, nor was SpaceX designed by or Tesla or Twitter, whatever the hell the Twitter thing is now. I've stopped keeping track of it, but you know what I mean. These guys, none of these people did this by themselves. None of them.
Yep.
So don't feel like you have to. That's all.
There you go. No, I think that's a good place to stop. I'm going to ask Tom to hang around a little bit here because we're going to have a little bonus deal here talking about not being able to build something by yourself. You may want to hang around for, but if you can't, that's okay. So this is our regular episode of Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. I'd like to thank Tom Libby for coming on and talking with us today. And,
always.
And with that, for right now anyway, we're out.